Shaquille O'Neal boarded the world's most elite luxury cruise with one question: why him? Whispers followed his footsteps. Fake smiles greeted his presence. And behind velvet curtains, a secret society judged his worth in silence. But when the mockery reached the stage, Big Shaq didn't shout. He stood tall, and with a story only truth could carry, he left the powerful breathless. This wasn't just a cruise, it was a test, and Shaq broke the system without breaking a thing. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It began with an envelope. Not an email, not a text, not even one of those sleek platinum-colored digital invites rich people love to brag about. No, this was an envelope, heavy, cream-colored, with a gold seal that shimmered slightly in the morning light, pouring through Shaquille O'Neal's kitchen window. It was addressed in perfect calligraphy, not to Shaquille O'Neal, not even Big Shaq, just Shaquille. That alone made him pause. He turned it over, inspecting the seal like a detective with a clue. It was pressed with a crest, a lion, a tree, and a ship. Underneath, the words, Legacy and Luxury, March 16th, March 23rd. A voyage honoring those who built the bridge. No sender, no logo, just an RSVP card and a black metal card with his name etched on it. The details were crisp, clean, and vague in all the ways that piqued curiosity. Departing from Miami, no guest list disclosed. Formal attire required. He was being invited not as a celebrity, but as a legacy. That word sat strange on his tongue. Shaq had learned long ago that the world treated you different depending on how you walked into a room. He'd walked into rooms as a 7-foot rookie, a world champion, a joker, a commentator, even a DJ. But this was something else. It didn't want his spotlight. It wanted his bloodline. He mentioned the invitation to his mother, Lucille, over lunch. She gave him that look, the kind mothers give when they know something, but don't want to say it directly. Sounds like they want to size you up, she said, stirring her iced tea. Rich folks got more rules than the IRS. Still, there was something in her voice, some softness behind the warning. She told him to go. Sometimes you let the lion walk through the ballroom, she said. See who pretends not to see him. And so Shaq went. Not with his entourage, not with cameras, just him, a single bag, and that metal card tucked into his coat pocket. He boarded the cruise ship from a private terminal, the kind you don't know exists until you get an invitation like that. The ship was massive, pristine, and so quiet it almost didn't feel like it floated on water. Staff moved like ghosts. Guests were ushered aboard with silent nods, glasses of champagne offered with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Shaq's room, correction. His suite was stunning. Marble floors, ocean view balcony, vintage leather books, even a piano he knew he wouldn't play, but appreciated anyway. A letter sat on the bed. Mr. O'Neal, welcome aboard. Thank you for honoring our voyage with your presence. Signed only with the crest. No name, no title, just a feeling, like walking into a country club that smelled faintly of judgment. Still, Shaq didn't flinch. He'd built arenas from sweat. He'd seen both ends of the wealth spectrum. And right now, he wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here because something in his gut told him there was more to this than champagne toasts and overpriced suits. Something behind the crest, something they weren't saying. The ship let out its horn. The ocean stretched endless ahead. Behind him, Miami disappeared in the haze. Ahead, something strange, something old, something rich in all the wrong ways. And Shaq, wearing a simple gray hoodie, and that quiet strength only real ones carry, leaned on the railing and watched the sea take him there. The ship hadn't been at sea an hour before Shaq started to feel it. Not the rocking of the waves, those he could handle. It was something else, something quieter, something colder. It drifted around him like fog that didn't touch the skin, just the soul. He was used to attention, from the courts to the cameras, from kids pointing him out at airports, to grown men asking for selfies in grocery stores. Shaq never minded it. He wore fame like a loose jacket. But this wasn't that. This wasn't excitement or awe. It was curiosity dipped in contempt. It was the look you give someone you didn't expect to see in your club. It was the hush that follows a storm no one wants to admit is coming. The smiles were there. Sure, glossy, white, practiced. The handshakes were warm but loose. The nods of acknowledgement, just a beat too slow. The conversations, if they happened at all, were short, surface level, and often ended with someone pivoting to the next person in their social ladder. Shaq knew how to read a room. And this room, this floating ballroom of inheritance and hidden histories, had already decided who belonged in its orbit, and who was just passing through. At lunch on the second day, Shaq found himself seated near the rear of the upper deck cafe, not by design, but because the hostess kept hesitating as she looked over the seating chart. It wasn't overt. No one said anything, but Shaq noticed when she skipped his name, then placed him beside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Beautiful view, furthest from the center of conversation. A kind way to put him near the edge, both literally and socially. Across from him sat a couple dressed in pastel linen. The man wore gold-rimmed sunglasses indoors, and the woman's bracelets clicked every time she lifted her mimosa. They smiled politely when he sat down, but didn't speak. Not until their friends arrived, loud and loose with laughter. One of them, a man with silvered hair and a face that had clearly fought aging with expensive science, leaned in toward the group and said just loud enough, "So, are we doing charity seating now?" Laughter fluttered around the table like confetti at a wake. Shaq didn't look up. He buttered his toast and took a sip of his coffee. The woman beside him reached for a napkin, glanced at him, then away, her mouth tight, like she wanted to say something but wouldn't, or couldn't. That same afternoon, while walking the observation deck, he overheard a conversation between two men standing near the railing. One was younger, maybe early 30s, crisp haircut, and a blazer he didn't need in this weather. The other was older, slower moving, but clearly used to being listened to. The younger man asked, "Who's the giant?" The older one chuckled and said, "That's O'Neal, right?" The athlete, used to bounce balls, thought he retired. "Yeah, but what's he doing here?" The younger one asked, puzzled. "I thought this cruise was for contributors. You know, builders, legacy people." The older man shrugged. Maybe someone wanted a mascot. Shaq stood just a few feet away, his reflection caught in the mirrored glass beside him. He stared at it for a moment, not because he was surprised, he wasn't, but because even after all these years, it still stung. Not like a wound, more like a bruise that never faded. Later that evening, the main lounge hosted a themed cocktail hour called Bridges of Legacy. Each guest was assigned a table marked by symbols, trees, towers, family crests. Shaq's table had no symbol, just his name, engraved on a silver card. When he arrived, there were already 6 people seated. They looked up, then down again, as if a waiter had joined them. One man made a comment about branding, and asked Shaq if he ever missed the simpler days of playing sports for a paycheck, instead of collecting cruises for clout. Shaq leaned back, watching the ice melt in his glass. "I never played for a paycheck," he said calmly. "I played because my mom said we didn't have enough." The man blinked, laughed awkwardly, and raised his glass. "To moms then." Shaq nodded, but didn't toast. It wasn't that everyone on the ship was cruel. That would have been too easy. No, it was more dangerous than that. It was the practiced politeness, the gentle erasure, the way they turned every interaction into a social audit. Shaq wasn't being attacked, he was being dismissed, and that's harder to fight. On the third morning, he decided to skip the brunch. He walked the lower deck instead, near the crew quarters. That's where he met Willard, an old man who tuned the baby grand piano in the music room and smoked clove cigarettes behind the storage area. Willard had played backup for Ray Charles once. Now he tuned keys for people who never listened. "Funny thing," Willard said, not looking up from the piano strings. "How folks say they love culture, but only when it's framed and silent." Shaq smiled. "You ever play for this crowd?" Willard chuckled. "They don't want songs, they want ambiance. I give 'em silence with notes in it." That night, Shaq wandered to the crew bar. It was unofficial, a tucked-away lounge where off-shift staff relaxed. He didn't want fanfare. He wanted real. He found Cammy there, young, sharp-eyed, a housekeeper who poured her own drinks and rolled her own eyes at bad jokes. She looked up when Shaq walked in, raised an eyebrow and said, "Wrong deck, legend." "I'm right where I want to be," Shaq replied, easing into a chair. They talked about everything and nothing. Cammy told him how the guests never saw her. "Not really. They see the uniform," she said. "Not the girl. I'm wallpaper. Useful. Invisible." Shaq leaned back, arms crossed. "I know that one," Cammy smirked. "No you don't." Shaq just looked at her. She paused, then nodded. "Okay. Maybe you do." It became a rhythm. Days among the elites. The champagne smiles, the subtle digs, the endless presentations of wealth, disguised as conversation. Nights among the crew, where jokes landed, silences were shared, and nobody cared about your name, unless you used it with respect. On the fourth day, Sterling Vance cornered him again. It was after a financial panel on generational power, where Sterling had smugly explained how wealth, when pure, should be preserved among those who understand its weight. Afterward, in the hallway, Sterling clasped Shaq's shoulder like a camp counselor. "You know," he said, "I admire you. You've evolved from the courts to this. It's a rare transition, but the game's different here." Shaq tilted his head. "What game is that?" Sterling smiled. "This one's quieter, and blood matters more than skill. That's all." Shaq didn't answer. He just stared at the man. Not angry, just aware. Sterling walked away with the same grin. That night, alone on the bow, Shaq watched the sea churn under the stars. The wind had picked up, the sky was darker than before, and the ship, beautiful, brilliant, cold, pressed forward into deeper water. There were moments when he considered leaving, taking the next helicopter out. But something in him stayed, not out of pride, not even out of stubbornness. It was something else, something that told him this voyage wasn't just about him. It was about what this ship represented, what this floating ecosystem of legacy and luxury hid behind its curated smiles. And maybe, just maybe, it was time someone stopped pretending not to notice. Because under the fine suits and delicate wines and vintage string music, this wasn't just a cruise, it was a mirror. And Shaq was the crack running through it. The dining hall on Deck 5 wasn't open to everyone. No signs marked it, no announcements mentioned it. Guests who were meant to be there simply received a gold-trimmed card slipped beneath their door the night before. Shaq found his just after turning in from another long walk along the lower deck. It was tucked beneath his doormat, sealed with wax bearing the same lion tree ship crest from his original invitation. No name, just a time and place: brunch, solarium room, 11 a.m., formal attire required. He arrived on time, dressed sharp but simple, a dark blue suit, no tie. He'd never been one for loud fashion or unnecessary flair. He stepped into the solarium, expecting a regular high-end brunch. Maybe more awkward, small talk, more stares that didn't quite meet his eyes. Instead, he found an experience curated like a performance. Sunlight streamed through curved glass panels above them, warming the circular room. Chandeliers floated like jellyfish, soft and glowing. A long horseshoe-shaped table dominated the space, already filled with the who's who of the cruise's upper echelon. The bloodline elites, the legacy investors, the last-name first-name types. Waiters in white tuxedos moved silently between them, refilling crystal glasses, and placing tiny square dishes that looked more like decoration than food. Shaq scanned the table and spotted Sterling Vance at the far end, already mid-laugh, surrounded by a cluster of guests clinging to every word. Sterling caught Shaq's eye and gestured with a raised flute of champagne, the grin never leaving his face. "Big man made it," he called, loud enough for heads to turn. "Feared you might have gotten lost on the way up here." Polite chuckles circled the room. Shaq smiled, not showing teeth, and moved to the empty seat marked with a silver card bearing only his initials. He sat, adjusted his chair, and waited. A young woman, maybe mid-20s, in a green velvet dress and diamond earrings like frozen tears, raised a hand and said, "Shall we start the game now that everyone's here?" Another man, short and tanned with a voice that belonged to a hedge fund commercial, clapped twice. "Yes, the legacy game." He turned to the newcomers. "For those who haven't played, it's simple. We ask each other questions, real questions, about heritage, history, contribution. If you answer well, you keep your glass. If not, it's taken." Shaq tilted his head. "What happens when you lose your glass?" The man grinned. "Then you sit in silence and reflect." Sterling leaned forward. "It's our version of humility hour. Don't worry, it's all in good fun." He turned to the group. "Let's begin with something easy." A woman named Celeste, long neck, longer last name, started the round. "I come from the Lovell textile family, founded in 1892. My question is, what material did my great-grandfather import to revolutionize Southern manufacturing?" Someone answered, "Egyptian cotton," and was met with applause. The next question came from a man whose tone was permanently bored. My father's father served as an ambassador to 3 countries. Which one was the first? Belgium, someone replied. Laughter. Clinks of crystal. No one missed a beat.
Then it was Sterling's turn.
He stood, theatrically tapping a spoon against his glass. Okay, this one's for all the legacy points. He grinned, eyes scanning the table. We've talked about what we've built, what we've owned, who we've descended from. But what about culture? What about earned legacy? He looked directly at Shaq. Shaquille, he said, voice syrupy sweet. Can I call you that? You just did, Shaq said calmly. Sterling nodded, taking it in stride. Right. Here's your question. Open floor. Name a cultural achievement from American history not tied to commerce or politics that your family directly contributed to. The room went still. The only sound was the faint clinking of a fork from the far corner. Shaq didn't move. He didn't blink. He just looked at Sterling, studied his grin, the way his eyes glistened behind thin gold-rimmed glasses. Shaq placed his glass down gently. My mother, he said, Lucille O'Neal. She raised 6 kids, worked multiple jobs, went back to school later in life, and earned her doctorate in education, taught women how to find their voices again. There was a pause, a long one. Someone coughed. Sterling tilted his head. That's inspiring. He looked around the table, waiting for laughter that didn't come this time. Though I think the question was about broader cultural contribution. Art, literature, philosophy. Shaq leaned back. My family contributed to survival, to dignity. If you don't think that's culture, maybe you've been sitting in the wrong rooms. No one laughed. Not even Celeste. Sterling gave a thin smile and raised his hands. Point taken. Just a game. But the energy shifted. Shaq felt it like a crack in the wall. The smiles were thinner now. The jokes a little more clipped. The brunch, which had started light, now hummed with tension under the surface. Sterling, never one to back down, tried to pivot. Let's try something else. Lightning round. He pointed at random guests. Quick answers. 10 seconds. Legacy impact. Go. One woman said, my grandfather funded the construction of 5 libraries. Another boasted, my family endowed the Whitford Museum. A man near Shaq said, we own the patent to the Easy Fold medical stretcher. Hospitals worldwide. Sterling turned back to Shaq. Your turn. Shaq sipped water first, then slow and even. My foundation's built over 150 homes for families who had none. Not because we had to, because we knew what it meant to sleep on floors. Silence again. Not the respectful kind. The comfortable kind. The kind that made you realize some people don't know how to measure worth outside of inheritance. The woman in velvet finally spoke. That's beautiful. But we're talking generational, aren't we? Shaq nodded. Some of us didn't inherit land. We inherited strength. That's worth more than your vaults. Her smile faded. Sterling pushed back from his chair slightly. Don't take it personally, Shaquille. We're just exploring our backgrounds. Understanding where we all come from. It's how the world builds trust. Shaq looked across the table, meeting the eyes of every guest. You want to talk trust? Start by listening to people who built their lives without your kind of safety net. Someone whispered, why is he so defensive? Shaq heard it. He always did. That old trick, make the person uncomfortable, then call them sensitive. Shift the blame without owning the blade. He stood up, slow, steady. His napkin dropped beside the plate. Y'all keep your glasses, he said. I'll keep my peace. He turned to leave, but not before catching Sterling's smirk. Small, satisfied, like a man who thinks he's won something. Shaq didn't give him the satisfaction of a second glance. He stepped out of the solarium and into the sunlight. The ocean greeted him like it always did. Wide, real, and honest in ways people rarely were. He stood at the railing, breathing slow, letting the air clear the noise. He didn't feel angry. He felt tired. The kind of tired that came from always being asked to explain your existence. The kind that settled deep in the bones, past muscle and marrow, where pride had long become a kind of armor. He thought of his mother, of the lessons buried in her silence, of her saying once, let them speak in riddles, baby. You stay whole. He wasn't here to win games. He was here to see them. The glass walls of that solarium might have looked clean, but behind them, the games weren't over. They were just beginning. And Shaq? He just played his first move. Cammy pulled the thread through her shoe one last time, tied it off and set it aside. How bad was it today? She asked, not looking up. Shaq hesitated. Let's just say, they got games. And I'm not built for pretending they're harmless. Reese poured a glass of water and slid it across the table toward Shaq. They're not harmless. That's the point. That's why they smile while they're playing. The room went quiet again. But it wasn't empty. It was heavy, weighted with stories none of them had asked to carry. But each had learned to bear. You ever notice how they look at you when they think you're not looking? Cammy asked suddenly, her voice more bitter than sad. Not just curiosity. It's like they're trying to figure out how you got in, like you're a code someone forgot to reset. Willard nodded slowly. They look at me like I'm music without a stage. Play for them. Sure, but don't expect them to listen. Reese leaned on the bar, his elbows pressing deep into the wood. I've worked every kind of ship, carnival, celebrity, even private gigs. But this one's different. It's not about money. These people don't just want to be rich. They want to make sure you know they're richer. They want silence when you walk by. They want your posture to shrink. Shaq sipped the water. I've been big my whole life. They still try to make me feel small. Reese chuckled. Then you know the dance. Nod. Smile. Don't talk too much. Don't talk too loud. And God forbid you correct them. Cammy sat up straighter now, warming to the space. Had a woman throw her scarf on the floor next to me this morning. Didn't say a word. Just stared until I picked it up. Shaq blinked. She say thank you. Cammy shook her head. Didn't have to. Her eyes already said she owned the air between us. Willard reached for his glass of tea. They don't see us. Not really. Just reflections they don't like. Shaq leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. How do y'all deal with it? Day after day? Willard didn't answer right away. He stared at his guitar, fingers tracing invisible chords across the air. Finally he said, You remember who you were before they told you who you're not. You remember your mama's voice. The smell of your street in summer, the first time you made someone feel seen. You hold on to that like a hymn. Cammy nodded. You remind yourself that being invisible to them doesn't mean you don't exist. Doesn't mean you're wrong. Reese added. And sometimes, you come down here, you sit with people who see you, and you breathe. Shaq let that sink in. He thought about the faces upstairs, the laughter that carried no warmth, the questions that were traps dressed as curiosity. He thought about Sterling's grin, about velvet dresses and empty toasts, and he thought about Lucille, his mother, raising her voice in church halls when the world had tried to quiet her. She used to say, Shaq said softly, they'll try to write your story with their ink, but your hands are still on the pen. Willard smiled. Sounds like a woman who knew. She did, Shaq said. Still does. There was a beat of silence. Then Willard picked up the guitar again, slowly strumming something smooth and slow, a tune without words, one that knew sorrow and grace in equal parts. Cammy leaned back, closed her eyes. Reese moved behind the bar, but his rhythm slowed. Even the buzz of the vending machine seemed softer now. Shaq sat still, the music soaking into him. He felt the ship vibrating faintly beneath his feet, the low hum of engines pushing through black water. He felt the contrast of above and below, one level built to showcase power, the other carved out of resilience. He wasn't here for luxury anymore. That illusion had peeled away days ago. He was here for something else now. He wasn't sure what yet, not exactly, but he knew it wasn't about proving anything. It was about witnessing, about listening, about remembering the names no one announced over microphones. Later that night, as the crew dispersed one by one, Shaq stayed behind. He helped stack chairs, not because he had to, but because he wanted to feel the weight of something real. Willard gave him a nod before slipping out with his guitar. Reese wiped down the counter, and Cammy grabbed her mop and bucket. As she passed, she paused. You know what the difference is between them and us? Shaq looked up. Tell me. She tilted her head, eyes sharp. They were born with maps. We had to make our own compasses. Shaq nodded. Deeply. And somehow we still get there. Cammy smiled, faint but genuine. Then she disappeared down the hall. When Shaq finally returned to his suite, the walls felt colder. The marble didn't impress. The gold fixtures felt hollow. He sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, and stared at the moonlight filtering through the curtains. He wasn't just a guest anymore. He was a witness. And witnesses don't look away. The announcement came mid-morning, slipped onto breakfast trays like every other elegant surprise aboard the ship. a printed gold card atop the linen napkin, stamped with the crest. This one read, "The Legacy Portrait Auction, tonight at 8, dress code, regal opulence." Shaq held the card between his fingers, studying the phrase like it was written in code. Regal opulence, he muttered. He had a feeling that whatever was planned for that night wasn't just about art. It was about power, dressed up as elegance. Another stage. Another game. By the time evening arrived, the grand atrium had been transformed. Velvet curtains were drawn across the high arched windows, casting the space in a warm amber glow. An auctioneer's podium stood in the center, flanked by easels cloaked in black cloth. Dozens of chairs fanned out in concentric circles around the stage, arranged so that every seat had a perfect view, not just of the art, but of each other. Waitstaff moved like dancers in choreographed silence, offering flutes of something expensive and sparkling. The guests arrived dressed in jewels and arrogance. The theme had brought out the worst in them. Crowns fashioned from real gold, sashes with embroidered family crests, gloves that hadn't been worn since the days their ancestors bought counties, not condos. Shaq wore a simple black suit, no flash, no cufflinks. He entered the room without a word, but the glances returned immediately. He knew by now how to read them. Each glance was a question they didn't have the guts to ask out loud. The auction began without much ceremony. A woman with a voice like polished stone welcomed them, thanked them for their presence, and introduced the evening as a celebration of legacy immortalized through oil and canvas. One by one, the cloths were drawn from the easels, revealing portraits of guests, painted in the style of monarchs, conquerors, and aristocrats. First was Lord Halston Mayers, depicted in a red velvet robe, with an ermine collar and scepter in hand. The guests clapped and laughed as he mockingly bowed. The bidding started at 5,000. Sterling Vance won it with a smirk and a wink. Next was Celeste, draped in gold armor, her eyes distant like some 14th century queen preparing for war. Then came the financier couple, painted together as Caesar and Cleopatra. On and on it went, with each unveiling met by applause, and bidding wars that were more about ego than charity. Then came a pause. The next easel was wheeled to the center, and the woman at the podium looked down at her cue card. "This next piece," she said, "is of a man whose presence graces this voyage with a rather unique legacy." Shaq straightened slightly, feeling the shift in air. Some guests turned toward him already, anticipation curling in their posture. The cloth came down. A moment of silence. Then, laughter. The painting was of Shaq, unmistakably, but twisted, distorted. His head was exaggerated in size, a caricature of his real form. His expression was frozen in an exaggerated grin, teeth too white, eyes almost cartoonish. He was dressed in a medieval court jester's garb, bells on his hat, mismatched shoes, hands raised as if in performance. The laughter wasn't cruel in volume. It was cruel in tone, muted, controlled. The kind of laughter meant to humiliate without confrontation. The kind that said, "We're still laughing, and you're not supposed to fight it." Shaq didn't move. He didn't react. He simply stared at the portrait, then at the woman holding the cloth with eyes a little too proud of her reveal. He looked next at Sterling, who sat back smugly in his seat, arms crossed, not bidding, just waiting. The others followed suit. No one reached for their paddle. Not yet. The joke hadn't landed fully, and they wanted to savor the echo. Then, slowly, a soft voice rose from the side of the room. "I'll start the bidding at 10,000. Heads turned. She was seated near the back, a woman dressed in an emerald shawl and pearl earrings that seemed too old to sparkle, but did anyway. Her hair was silver, swept into a classic chignon. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. Shaq had never seen her before, or maybe he had, but no one had noticed her. Not until now. The auctioneer faltered slightly, then recovered. 10,000. "Do I hear 11? Silence. For once Sterling had nothing to say. The woman raised her chin slightly, eyes never leaving the stage. "Or perhaps," she said, voice just loud enough to carry, "we could remove the piece altogether. It's clearly not meant to be art." A hush spread like a fog bank. Sterling cleared his throat. "Come now, Eleanor. It's satire. Good fun." The woman turned slowly to him. "I don't believe humiliation ever qualified as art. At least, not the kind worth framing." Shaq watched her closely now. Her composure, her precision. She didn't flinch. She didn't soften her tone to cushion egos. She spoke with the certainty of someone who'd spent her life watching people use charm to disguise cruelty. The auctioneer adjusted her papers, murmured something to the assistant, then cleared her throat. Perhaps we'll move forward. The piece will be temporarily withdrawn at the bidder's request. The cloth went back over the easel. The moment passed, but it didn't vanish. It lingered in the room like the aftertaste of something bitter. The next portrait was revealed, and the guests clapped as if nothing had happened. But Shaq felt it in the stillness that came from certain corners, in the awkward shuffle of feet, in the way eyes now avoided him. When the auction ended, the guests scattered in polite disarray, conversations bubbling up to distract from what couldn't be unsaid. Shaq moved to the exit slowly. As he reached the door, he heard a voice behind him. "You held your ground better than most kings I've known." He turned. It was the woman in green. Eleanor. She didn't extend a hand. She didn't smile too wide. She simply looked at him, directly, clearly. "Eleanor Crest," she said. "Though I imagine most people here would rather I stayed quiet. Comes with having opinions that don't match the upholstery." Shaq nodded once. "Appreciate what you did in there." Eleanor looked past him for a moment, then back. "It wasn't for you, it was for them. You didn't need defending, but they needed reminding." He studied her face. She didn't blink, didn't shift. "You've seen this kind of thing before," he said. She exhaled slowly. "You grow up with these people. You learn to hear the things they don't say. They turn you into furniture, and if you make noise, they call it rebellion. But I stopped apologizing decades ago." Shaq tilted his head. "Why now? Why speak up tonight?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Because for once, someone else didn't flinch. There was something else in her gaze. Not just awareness, but history. As if she carried stories deeper than anyone in that room knew how to read. Shaq stepped back slightly. "Guess we'll see if the painting gets a second showing." Eleanor nodded. "It might, but they won't forget tonight. That much I promise." With that, she turned and walked down the hallway, her footsteps soft but firm. Shaq stood alone at the door for a moment, watching the guests disappear into glittering corridors and private lounges. The laughter had quieted. The clinking of glasses was more subdued now. The show was over, but something underneath had shifted. He thought about the portrait, the way they'd tried to shrink him with a brush, and a smirk, but he hadn't reacted. He hadn't let the sting show, and somehow that had said more than words ever could. And somewhere on that ship, a woman named Eleanor had seen it too. Whatever this cruise was supposed to be, celebration, judgment, masquerade, it wasn't over. But now, Shaq wasn't the only one watching. He had an ally. Or maybe a mystery. Either way, the game had changed. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Close to what?" She stirred her tea, slowly. "That's why I asked you here. Because if anyone's gonna call it out for what it is, it won't be someone like me. It'll be someone who never asked to be here in the first place." Shaq leaned back. Quiet. Waiting. Eleanor took a breath. "I was 21 when I left home. My father disowned me for marrying a jazz musician from Savannah. Black. Talented, beautiful, the kind of man who turned rooms into religion without raising his voice." Her eyes glistened briefly, but she blinked it away. "My family saw him as a disgrace, said he was charming. Yes, but not the kind of man to build legacy with." Shaq didn't interrupt. "We lived modestly for a few years," she continued. "He played dive bars. I worked libraries. We were happy, for a while, until he got sick. And my family, they never visited. Not once, even when I told them he was dying." Her voice faltered, but only briefly. "When he passed, I got a letter from my father. No condolence, just a line that said, 'You may return now. We won't speak of him.'" She set the spoon down gently. "I didn't go back. Not for 20 years. Shaq nodded, his voice low. "And now, I came back because I wanted to see if anything had changed." It hadn't. The breeze tugged at her shawl. She pulled it tighter, not out of cold, but reflex. "This cruise," she said, her voice lowering, "isn't just a celebration. It's a selection. A screening. They invite high-profile figures, wealthy names, old families, not just to network, but to evaluate, to decide who gets to be part of something bigger." Shaq narrowed his eyes. "Bigger than what?" She looked him dead in the eye. "Control." Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a thin black folder. She slid it across the table slowly. "I shouldn't have this. It was left in my suite by mistake. Or maybe not. Maybe someone wanted me to see it. Shaq opened it cautiously. Inside were printed profiles. Dozens. Photos, names, bloodlines, professions. Each profile had a coded number beside it, and an emblem. Some had checks, some had X's. A few were marked pending. His own face stared back at him from one of the pages. Name Shaquille O'Neal. Status pending evaluation. Underline. High public trust, low lineage weight. He frowned. What is this? It's not a guest list, Eleanor said. It's a filtration system. They're building something, a private investment coalition, or a new society, or something worse. A way to preserve their definition of legacy. And that means choosing who belongs. Not based on who has money, but who fits the model. Shaq's mind raced. He flipped to more pages. He saw celebrities, CEOs, descendants of political dynasties, and below them, notes about ancestry, affiliations, influence over public opinion. This isn't just about class, he said. It's about power. Eleanor nodded. Exactly. Controlled influence. Cultural steering. They think if they gather the right people in one place long enough, they can shape the next 100 years without public interference. Shaq closed the folder. So why me? Because you disrupt the pattern, she said. You're wealthy, beloved, grounded. You don't owe anyone your name, and that terrifies them. You're the reminder that legacy can come from love, not blood, that power doesn't always need permission. He sat back, absorbing it. And now, she said, softer, they want to see how you'll react. Will you conform? Will you perform? Or will you challenge it? Shaq exhaled. You said they're close to something. What do you mean? I heard whispers last night, she replied. Sterling and his circle, they're preparing to offer something, to a select few. Access to a private fund, a council, a hidden board. Once you're in, there's no out. They call it the ledger, everything from politics to media to education. They want to influence it all. Quietly, permanently. Shaq's jaw clenched. And this cruise is the recruitment pitch. Eleanor looked tired now. Exactly. And they've done it before. Smaller circles, less public names. But now they're scaling. If this works, it won't just be a legacy cruise. It'll be a legacy empire. He closed the folder and slid it back to her. Why are you telling me? Because you remind me of someone I loved. Someone who didn't flinch in rooms like this. She paused. And because I'm too old to fight this from the inside. But you're not. Silence settled between them for a moment, filled only by the quiet lap of waves against the hull. What happens now? Shaq asked. Eleanor reached for her tea again. That depends on you. But whatever you decide, don't underestimate them. They don't use violence. They use design. They use silence. And most of all, they use shame. Shaq looked out at the sea, vast and indifferent. His face was calm, but inside, the gears had begun to turn. Everything he'd seen on this cruise, the backhanded smiles, the mocking laughter, the false welcomes, they weren't random. They were pressure tests. Seeing what he'd tolerate, seeing if he'd break. He wouldn't. He'd been tested before. Not with wine and linen, but with poverty, doubt, and grind. And he'd survived all of it. Now he knew what he was dealing with. And for the first time, the game was no longer theirs to control. The deeper into the ship Shaq wandered, the quieter things became. It was early evening, a few hours before another formal dinner, and the top decks buzzed with rehearsed laughter and silverware clinks. But below, in the auxiliary levels, the world shifted. Gone were the chandeliers, the marble floors, the curated playlists drifting through hidden speakers. Down here, it was steel walls and forgotten silence. The ship spun. Shaq had meant only to find a shortcut to the service hallway. He wasn't trying to explore. He wasn't chasing anything. But that's how truth usually shows up, not with spotlights but by accident. He turned a corner and noticed a door left slightly ajar. Unlike most others, this one didn't carry a staff-only sign or a maintenance label. No brass plaque, no lock, just a thin strip of light seeping out beneath it, and the faint hum of ventilation. He paused, listening. No voices, no footsteps. Curiosity pressed in. He pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The room wasn't large, but it felt weighty, like it wasn't built for relaxation or comfort. The lights were low, indirect, bouncing off dark wood panels, and a slate floor. Along the left wall stood a long touchscreen panel, glowing faintly. But what drew his eye, what froze him, was the wall opposite it. A towering digital display spanned the entire length. On it, rows upon rows of profiles glowed in crisp white text. Each profile had a name, a portrait, and beneath it a short list of metrics. Shaq stepped closer, narrowing his eyes. Net worth, family lineage, educational prestige, public influence score. Each category was followed by a rating: A, B, or C. Some had red marks beside them. Others had gold stars. He scanned the wall. Names he recognized: CEOs of international firms, heirs to banking empires, former senators, actors, socialites. Their faces flicked across the screen, like trading cards for the world's elite. He stepped to the side, watching as the board subtly reorganized itself. The top row shifted, showcasing a name he remembered hearing earlier in the cruise: Fletcher Aldwin, listed as multi-generation estate controller. His profile had all A. Notes beside his name read: inherited real estate trust, direct Ivy bloodline, stable press presence. Shaq's chest tightened. This wasn't just documentation. This was evaluation. He kept scanning until, suddenly, a face he knew too well filled the center panel. There it was, his own profile. The image used was stiff, dated, not candid, not warm, just a formal headshot, pulled from some archival source. Beneath it, the data appeared: net worth, lineage, cultural impact, public image, societal contribution. There were notes too. Smaller text like footnotes meant to inform but not honor. High public appeal, limited ancestral prestige, known for philanthropy, though not generational. Entertainment figure, with significant influence, lacks institutional roots. Considered for legacy partner tier, pending alignment behavior. Shaq took a step back. Pending alignment behavior. That phrase sat heavier than all the others combined. It wasn't just judgment. It was a warning, an expectation, an invitation to compliance. This wasn't a record of legacy. It was a manual for exclusion. He glanced at other profiles. Cammy wasn't listed. Neither was Reese. None of the crew appeared on the board. Not even Eleanor, though he suspected her file had once been here, and then removed. This wasn't about who was on the ship. It was about who would be allowed off with something more than memories. In the corner of the screen, a rotating logo caught his eye. The same crest embossed on every invitation. The lion, the tree, the ship. But now, beneath it, a title appeared. Shaq stared at the words. They weren't decorative. They weren't ceremonial. They were operational. This cruise wasn't just celebration. It was selection. He reached toward the panel, instinctively brushing the screen. To his surprise, it responded. A quiet click revealed a second tier of data. A menu: psychological profile, investment potential, cultural weight index. He scrolled to his own entry again, selecting the psychological tab. The screen loaded. Emotional temperament, control,
Risk of disruption. Moderate.
desire for belonging, high public, low private, strategic usefulness, conditional, based on compliance with social codes. He stared at the phrase, risk of disruption. So that's what he was to them: a variable, a formula to solve. Not a man, not a legacy, just a possibility. Footsteps echoed faintly down the corridor. Shaq quickly pressed the panel's side. The display darkened. The room dimmed. He stepped out as quietly as he had entered, pulling the door shut behind him. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He walked calmly through the corridor, eyes forward, mind burning. By the time he reached the crew lounge, his heart was steady, but his purpose had changed. Reese was there, drying glasses behind the counter. Willard sat by the radio, listening to a Miles Davis track. Cammy leaned against the wall, peeling a tangerine, her eyes scanning the crew rotation sheet. Shaq stepped in and dropped into the nearest chair. Reese looked up. "You all right?" Shaq nodded, slowly. "Yeah, just saw something I wasn't meant to." Willard raised a brow. "On this ship, that could be half the rooms." Shaq leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "They're keeping files, ratings, everyone on this cruise. Me, Sterling, the whole inner circle. They're grading people, deciding who fits and who doesn't." Reese froze, glass still in his hand. "What kind of grading? Influence, bloodline, behavior?" Cammy's head snapped up. "You serious?" Shaq nodded again, this time slower. There's a program, they call it the Ledger Initiative. It's not public, not on any brochure, but it's what this whole cruise is about. Not celebration, not legacy, control. Willard sat back, jaw tight. That's why we're invisible. We're not even on the board. They're not just watching, Shaq said. They're preparing. Reese shook his head, half in disbelief, half in fury. Preparing for what? Shaq looked at them all. The old jazzman. The bartender who never missed a detail. The housekeeper who knew when something didn't smell right. He spoke calmly. For who gets to own the future? The words settled heavy, but not hopeless. The silence that followed wasn't fear. It was clarity. They finally saw it, too. Shaq stood up, adjusting his shoulders like a man about to enter a ring. Not for sport, but for meaning. I need to know more, he said. What rooms they're hiding? Who's in on it? What comes next? Camming nodded, standing up. I've cleaned half the ship. I know which doors don't belong, Willard added. And I know who plays dumb but knows more than they admit. Reese leaned across the counter. You're not alone in this. Shaq met their eyes one by one. I know, he said, but they don't. Not yet. The final night of the cruise arrived like the last scene of a well-rehearsed play. Every inch of the ballroom had been polished to a mirror's shine. Crystal chandeliers swayed gently with the ship's slow rhythm, and gold-threaded drapes hung like theater curtains around tall windows that framed the endless Atlantic. A string orchestra tuned in the corner. Guests moved through the space like characters from a Gatsby novel, dressed in tuxedos and ball gowns that shimmered with legacy more than style. Shaq stood in front of the mirror in his suite, adjusting his black tux jacket. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't angry. He was ready. The folder Eleanor had handed him still sat in the drawer beneath the minibar, its contents burned into his mind. Names, ranks, ratings, and manipulation hiding behind manners. The Ledger Initiative wasn't theory anymore. It was machinery, and tonight it was humming at full speed. There was no escort, no formal invitation, just an expectation. Shaq walked to the ballroom alone. As he entered, heads turned. Not dramatically, just enough. Like the air shifted, and everyone felt it but didn't want to say why. Sterling Vance stood at the front of the stage, shaking hands, his suit a shade too confident. He had the look of a man about to win something invisible. The evening unfolded with careful pacing. Champagne toasts, a performance by a cellist who once played at the Met. Then came a series of honors handed out by a nameless committee, legacy sustainers, heritage ambassadors, future patrons. No one quite knew what the awards meant, but everyone clapped anyway. Shaq's name was the last on the program. Sterling took the stage with a practiced smile. Our final guest of honor tonight, he said, needs no introduction. His legacy in sports, business, and culture speaks volumes. But more than that, he reminds us that contribution comes in many forms. Sometimes through tradition, sometimes through present. Shaq didn't move at first. Then slowly he walked to the stage, accepting the small glass sculpture from Sterling's outstretched hand. It looked like a torch, but the flame was hollow. He held it in silence. Then he set it down on the podium. Without a word, he turned and walked off the stage. The room froze. Not gasped, froze. A beat too long. A second too still. Champagne glasses hovered mid-air. Cellists paused mid-note. Conversations evaporated. In the back, Eleanor sat near the bar. She didn't flinch. She simply nodded. Shaq turned before reaching the double doors. I need the mic, he said. A tech handed it to him without question. He stepped back onto the stage. No fanfare, no music. And then he spoke. The chandeliers shimmered overhead, delicate crystal bones swaying gently with the motion of the ship. The ballroom was quieter than usual. Maybe it was the anticipation. Maybe it was the tension that had been building for days. Either way, something hung in the air like the breath before a storm. The confrontation gala was meant to be the climax of the cruise, a symbolic closing ceremony, masquerading as celebration. Guests wore tuxedos stitched with family emblems, gowns sewn with ancestral pride. Sterling Vance stood at the podium, arms wide, commanding the room with the ease of a man who believed he owned it. And perhaps in his mind he did. He spoke of the great inheritance, about preserving culture in a disordered world. He talked of tradition, of blood, of heritage passed down like antique weapons, polished, unused, but always pointed somewhere. His voice was rich, trained, his smile calculated. Every word was dressed in civility, but Shaq knew what it hid. Beneath the metaphors and metaphysics, the message was clear. We decide who gets remembered and who doesn't. Then Sterling turned toward Shaq with a gracious wave of the hand. Now, he said, a voice of resilience, of excellence, a guest we've all admired, the man of the hour. Please, Mr. O'Neal, say a few words. Applause followed. Polite, perfunctory. Shaq rose from his seat at the edge of the stage. He didn't wear a crown or a sash. No fanfare followed him. Just the soft weight of expectation. Some of it mocking, some of it genuine, all of it watching. He approached the podium slowly, his presence enough to quiet even the most distracted elite. He stood there for a long moment before speaking, his eyes moving across the room, not with challenge, but with clarity. He wasn't there to perform. He was there to reveal. He didn't lean into the microphone. He didn't adjust his tie. He just began. I remember sitting on the floor of our apartment when I was a kid. The kind of place where the floor creaked more than the walls spoke. My mama, Lucille, used to come home from her second job, take off her shoes, and tell us stories, but not the kind you read in books. Her stories were about survival, about pride when you don't got much else. The room was still. She told me, baby, there'll be rooms you walk into where no one claps, where no one smiles, where you'll feel too big and still not seen. And she was right, because here I am, in another room just like that. He let the silence hold for a beat. No anger in his voice. No accusation. Just truth. I know what some of y'all see when you look at me. The athlete. The entertainer. The joke. The novelty. The man whose portrait you could twist and paint and laugh about like I ain't been human since the moment I walked in. He looked down briefly, then back up. I saw the wall. The profiles. The scores. I know what this cruise really is. It ain't a celebration. It's a sorting. Murmurs flickered at the edges of the room. But let me tell you something, he continued, voice steady. I grew up in rooms where nothing was promised. Not comfort, not safety, not acceptance. I built myself in those rooms. I didn't inherit a name that opened doors. I had to kick a few down, not to be famous but to be free. His gaze found Sterling, who now sat still, eyes unreadable. You talk about legacy like it's a birthright, like it's a vault only a few people get keys to. But I've seen more legacy in the hands of people who get ignored on this ship every day. He turned, gesturing to the back of the room. Reese, the bartender, his mother raised 4 kids alone. After their father disappeared, he saved for 6 years just to finish his degree. And now he's here sending money home, while people barely notice he exists. Cammy, he continued, voice unwavering, works 18-hour days, and still finds time to walk another crew member to her room so she doesn't feel unsafe in the dark. That's legacy. That's character. And Willard, the old jazz man who tunes your piano, he once played with Coltrane, and now y'all treat him like part of the furniture. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. You don't see them because you're not looking. You're too busy deciding who deserves to sit beside you, who deserves to speak, who deserves to belong. He paused. But I do see them. I always have. Because I come from them. He stepped back from the podium slightly, letting his words stretch across the silence. I've worn a lot of jerseys. Lakers, Heat, Celtics. But the real uniform I've worn, it's the one they gave me when I was born into a world that said, I'd never matter unless I proved it. Over, and over, and over again. A sharp breath cut through the room. Then stillness. You all build your walls with velvet and champagne, but they're still walls, and behind them, fear. Fear that someone might get through without your permission. Fear that power can grow from love, not lineage. He let those words hang. I don't need your awards. I don't need your check marks. I don't need your ledger. He turned back to the audience, this time softer, gentler. But what I do want is for someone in this room to ask themselves why they're so afraid of being equals. Why the only way you know how to feel strong is by making someone else feel small. A woman in the 3rd row lowered her eyes. Someone near the back shifted in their seat. Still, no one spoke. I'm not angry, Shaq said. I'm not here to yell. I've done that before. And I learned something. Anger gives people a reason not to listen. But truth? Real truth? It just sits with you. It doesn't shout. It doesn't force. It waits. It stays. He stepped away from the mic. This is me, telling the truth. And I hope for once y'all let it stay. He turned to walk off the stage. No applause followed. Not right away. The silence that held the room wasn't awkward. It wasn't uncertain. It was undone, unpeeled. A room that prided itself on elegance, suddenly stripped bare. Shaq didn't look back. He didn't wait for a reaction. He didn't need it. Because in that moment, he'd done what none of them could. He had stood tall without armor, spoken without permission, loved without needing to be loved back. And he left the stage not as a man who won anything, but as a man who had already let go of needing to. Behind him, the crowd remained still. A room full of power, silenced not by threat, but by a story they didn't know how to dismiss. Somewhere in that crowd, Eleanor watched with a knowing expression. Not proud, not emotional, just steady, because she understood what had just happened. Shaquille O'Neal had cracked the room without breaking it. And in doing so, he left them speechless. It does, Willard said, not because they'll admit it, but because now they know someone saw them. And more importantly, someone saw it. They stood in silence together, 4 souls against the vastness of the Atlantic. The sky overhead stretched wide, stars bleeding through thin clouds. In the distance, the faint outline of another ship shimmered on the horizon, a moving silhouette that seemed impossibly small against the ocean's breadth. Reese leaned on the railing beside him. Sterling didn't look happy. Good, Shaq muttered. Let him sit with it. You think this changes anything? Cammy asked, not sarcastic, curious. Shaq exhaled slowly. Not tonight. Maybe not even tomorrow. But truth has a way of leaking into places it ain't welcome. One crack at a time. Willard chuckled low. Man, you sound like my old trumpet teacher. He used to say, play a note honest enough, even liars start listening. They laughed, all of them, and the sound was different than the forced laughter of the elite. This one carried release, a bit of defiance, a lot of truth. Reese nodded toward the lower deck. Some of the crew saw a clip. Someone in the tech room streamed it down. Words already moving. Cammy added, I heard one of the junior stewards say, I didn't think we were allowed to talk like that on this ship. Then she said maybe she'd try. That stuck with Shaq. Maybe she'd try. Sometimes that's all you needed. A sliver of permission to believe your voice had weight. More silence. Then Willard spoke again. They won't forget tonight, even if they pretend they did. Shaq looked at him. You think that's enough? Willard shrugged. It's a start. Fire never begins big. It starts with a spark that refuses to go out. Below them, the ship continued its path. The lights on the water blurred softly, as if the ocean itself was trying to remember something. Reese sighed, then straightened. You gonna sleep tonight? Probably not, Shaq replied. But I won't toss around either. They all knew what that meant. The kind of peace that didn't come from comfort, but from finally speaking without apology. Eventually the others peeled off, one by one. Reese had an early shift. Willard wanted to tune his strings before bed. Cammy offered a brief shoulder touch, firm, grateful, and disappeared into the corridor with nothing more than a nod. Shaq stayed, alone again, but not lonely. The deck was almost empty now. Just a few guests drifting like unsure shadows, none brave enough to approach. Sterling never came. Neither did the captain. The ship's silence wasn't nervous anymore. It was sobered. Shaq looked up at the stars and thought of Lucille. He could almost hear her voice, steady, proud. Baby, just because they ain't clapping doesn't mean they ain't listening. He smiled. Not wide, not showy, just enough. Behind him, the ballroom lights began to dim. Chairs were being stacked, glasses cleared. And yet, something lingered. The speech wasn't viral. Not yet. But it was alive. Passed quietly, whispered between crew members. Noted silently by those who had listened, without knowing why it stirred something they'd buried. Shaq finally turned from the railing and walked back toward the elevator. As he stepped inside, a young staff member, maybe 19, maybe newer than most, stood holding the door. She didn't speak, didn't ask for a selfie, didn't even smile while. She just said, "Thanks for saying it." Shaq looked at her and replied softly, "Thanks for hearing it." The doors closed. And for the first time on the cruise, Shaq didn't feel like he was moving through someone else's ship. He felt like he was steering his own. The morning the ship approached port, the ocean was wrapped in mist. Gray clouds hung low, as if reluctant to let the passengers return to land without one last reckoning. From his balcony, Shaq watched the coastline emerge, like a secret finally ready to be confessed. The harbor's cranes and concrete jutted into view slowly. the illusion of isolation giving way to reality. He hadn't packed yet. Not because he was avoiding it, but because time felt different now. This journey had stretched something inside him, not like a wound, but like a scar forming in real time. And he knew once his feet touched the dock, the rest of the world would expect him to return to normal. But normal had been redefined somewhere between the ballroom and the truth. He stepped back inside his suite, expecting the usual, the scent of linen, the folded card on the pillow, reminding him to rate his experience, a staff member knocking with courtesy and detachment. But instead he found a single cream envelope resting on the edge of his nightstand. There was no hotel stationery, no ship emblem, just his name written in ink that looked older than the envelope itself. Shaquille. He stared at it for a moment. Then he opened it. The handwriting was familiar. Dear Mr. O'Neal, I've never liked goodbyes, so I've decided to leave without one. Consider it an old woman's final act of defiance, or mercy. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not off the ship, but off the roster. Removed from the records. My cabin will be empty, but my intentions, they'll linger. There's something you need to know. This cruise, the wine, the music, the velvet, none of it was about leisure. It was a final experiment. A soft trial for something larger. They call it inheritance by design. I was there when the idea was born, years ago. Back when I still believed legacy meant shaping the future with grace, not gatekeeping it through bloodlines. But the truth? It was always a ledger. A quiet club with deep pockets, deeper shame, and no shame in rewriting who belongs. I helped build it once, then I walked away. But they never stopped. Shaq read slowly, carefully. Each word pressed into him like footsteps across a quiet floor. They invited you not out of curiosity, but to measure, to test what happens when the fire doesn't come from their candles. You were the final variable, a legacy they couldn't claim, a power they didn't write. You passed every test they didn't know they were giving you. And because of that, I made a choice. Shaq turned the page. His heartbeat shifted. Last night, while the ballroom sat in silence, I found the backup terminal. Every file, every profile, the digital archive they thought I couldn't access. I burned it.
Not metaphorically, not symbolically.
I deleted the entire system and left a trail of corrupted logs so they couldn't recover it. What they spent years designing, scrubbed in 22 minutes and one match. They may rebuild it. They may try again. But not this version. Not this cycle. Not without consequence. Shaq sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. The mist outside had begun to lift, but inside the fog of realization was just thickening. I want you to know why I did it. Because when you stood on that stage and spoke like no one had ever owned your name, you reminded me of him. My husband. The one my family disowned me for. The one who played trumpet like prayer, and whose silence was the loudest protest I'd ever heard. You walked into their ballroom with your back straight, and your soul intact. That wasn't just courage, Shaquille. That was legacy. He closed his eyes. He could hear her voice in the words now. Not rehearsed, not performative. Just true. Like the sound of something finally free. This was never about breaking them. This was about waking them. And you did. Whatever comes next, whatever wind they stir or story they spin, it won't undo what you've done. And if they come for you with their smiles and ceremonies, remember, they only dress the cage in gold when they know the bird has learned to fly. With gratitude, Eleanor Crest. He folded the letter carefully. It didn't shake in his hands. He placed it back in the envelope and tucked it into his coat pocket, near his chest. He stood slowly and walked to the balcony again. Down below, port workers were already preparing the exit ramps. Luxury SUVs waited behind velvet ropes. Elites dragged designer luggage behind them. Already returning to the theater of land-based prestige. Shaq didn't rush. He sat on the balcony chair and watched them quietly, like a man who'd read the final chapter before the rest of the world knew the story had ended. An hour later his luggage was packed, and the suite was still. He didn't look back as he shut the door. He passed the cleaning staff, nodded respectfully. Kimi wasn't working that floor today. Neither was Reese. Willard had left before dawn. According to the hallway steward, the crew always disappeared fast, ghosts before gratitude could find them. At the foot of the ramp, Sterling stood with a group of men, talking low, moving with more restraint than usual. His eyes caught Shaq's once, briefly. He didn't smile, he didn't nod, just held the stare a second too long before looking away. Shaq smiled faintly. Not in triumph. In understanding. There were cracks in the machine now. He walked past the line of black cars. No escort. No attention. Just the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had returned the mask and kept the face beneath. As he reached the edge of the dock, a young man in a port uniform approached with a sealed envelope. "Sir," he said, "this was left for you at the staff desk." Shaq took it. Surprised, he opened it on the spot. Inside was a photo. Old, sepia-toned. A black man in a suit, trumpet in hand, smiling, eyes wide with light, standing beside a young woman in a simple dress with pearls. The caption on the back read, "Harlem, 1962, love, before the world made us choose." There was no signature. He folded the photo and placed it in the same pocket as Eleanor's letter. He walked on, through the waiting crowd, past the reporters who hadn't noticed him, past the lines of luxury, not avoiding it, not resenting it, just transcending it. He passed a group of passengers talking near the edge of the lot. One of them, a young woman, looked over and whispered, "That's him." Another said, "He didn't even raise his voice." Shaq kept walking, and for the first time in days, he didn't feel like he was stepping into someone else's story. He felt like he had closed a chapter of his own. Behind him, the ship still loomed, immaculate, polished, preserved, but somewhere in its circuitry, the ledger was gone. As the plane began to taxi, Shaq closed his eyes for a moment and thought of his mother. Lucille had always told him, "There's power in stillness, baby. When you can hold yourself steady in the wind, people don't forget that." He understood that now more than ever. The crews had tried to test him, not with obstacles, but with performance, with expectations, with quiet judgments disguised as celebration, and he hadn't resisted with rage. He'd met it with presence. He didn't flinch. He didn't shrink. He didn't apologize. He just spoke. And now, in a world starved for real, that was enough. When the flight landed, he exited calmly, luggage in hand, no fanfare at the arrivals. Just a few more looks. A nod from a TSA agent, a security guard who said, "Solid speech, sir," before stepping aside. In the parking lot, he moved toward the far edge where his black SUV waited. No chauffeur today, no tinted motorcade. He drove himself. As he opened the door, a voice called out gently behind him, "Excuse me, Mr. O'Neal." He turned. A young man, maybe early 20s, nervous, holding a small notebook and a pen. Shaq raised his chin slightly. "I'm not pressed," the kid said quickly. "I'm not trying to post anything." Shaq waited. The kid held up the notebook. I wanted to say thanks. For the story. For not trying to win. Just telling it." Shaq stepped forward and nodded once. "What's your name?" "Devin. You right?" "I'm trying," the kid said. "Trying to tell real stuff. Not just what sells." Shaq gave him a long, steady look. "Then keep trying. Don't wait until someone gives you permission." Devin blinked, surprised. "How'd you know that's what I was doing?" Shaq smiled. "Just barely. 'Cause I used to do it too." He opened the car door, slid inside, and shut it without another word. As he pulled away, Devin stood there still holding the notebook like it was heavier than it was. The road stretched ahead, traffic light. The sky cracked with pale blue. The city moved around him, unaware that something quiet was shifting. Not in headlines, not in algorithms, in people. At a red light, Shaq reached into his coat and pulled out the letter again. Eleanor's folded and soft at the edges now. He read it once more. The words didn't change, but somehow they felt different each time. Sharper, truer, like echoes that became full voices the longer they sat in you. He didn't know if he'd ever see her again. He didn't know if she'd board another ship or vanish into silence like a ghost who'd done her part. But she'd given him a gift. Not the truth, the choice to do something with it. And he had. The light turned green. He drove on. Hours later, after the drive, after the quiet return home, after the bags were unpacked and the night had settled, Shaq stood at his kitchen window. The city lights blinked in the distance. He wasn't thinking about press or influence or what the elites might try next. He was thinking about the way people had looked at him. Not like a star, not like a symbol, but like a man who had spoken into a quiet place they thought no one saw and filled it with light. The world hadn't changed, but something had cracked, something deep, and maybe, just maybe, that was the start of something new. He didn't post. He didn't speak on a podcast. He didn't tweet a quote or issue a recap. He just sat still. Present. Shaquille O'Neal. Big man. Bigger heart. And when the wind came, as it always did, he didn't flinch. If this story stirred something in you, don't scroll past it. Share it with someone who's walked into rooms that weren't built for them. Keep the conversation alive where silence used to live. Because sometimes, the most powerful shift begins when one person simply refuses to shrink. And if that moved you, there's more coming. Stay close.